Hey everyone, thank you for coming to this session. My name is Chris Traganos and I work on developer advocacy at Stripe. And today we're going to talk about stacks on stacks on stacks. So, really focusing on payment integrity, API upgrades, and open source. I just want to take a quick moment. I want to pause and just really say thank you to the crew running the big transaction this conference today. I remember a few months ago when they announced the conference, I was so excited because developers, APIs, and payments, that is the overlapping niche of audiences that I really care about. And I'm just learning so much through all the different sessions today. And so, obviously, really unfortunate for, I think we're all sick of being indoors in COVID, but especially for New Orleans, who went through the horrible storm a couple months ago. I'm just thinking of you all, and I cannot wait till next time when we can all be there together. And so, another way of thinking of this session is just really asking yourself this question: do you know all the pieces of code in between you and your customers? And so when we obviously it's a play on words, like stacks and stacks and stacks, but really thinking about like the integrity of your app stack. How do you understand how your payment stack is working, and also do you and or your team know how open source dependencies are being used and utilized in your company and in your business? And so I want to go through the overview and just the general premise of why this matters. I want to talk about the importance of mapping out your payment flows. I want to spend some time with providing some tips and practical suggestions for testing and upgrading APIs and SDKs. Definitely want to touch on open source dependencies and just the community in general. I'll share some guides and resources, and time permitting, would love to do Q&A. But regardless, I'm available afterwards for anyone who wants to talk more. And so I do want to make the note, yes, I am going to talk about payments in the context of Stripe. I work at Stripe. It's what I live, breathe, and eat. But that said, everything I'm covering is general best practices for payment APIs and upgrading your stack. And so when I say Stripe, if you're using a different payment provider, most likely they're going to have API versioning. They're going to be thinking about their SDKs. And so you can just extrapolate it to whatever your use case is. But yeah, so let's talk about Stripe. And so one quote I really like that has stayed with me for the last 3 years while I've worked here is the following, right? So a great API product stays out of the developer's way for as long as possible. So we certainly think a lot about building tools for builders. And if any of you are familiar with what we do, there's the infamous 7 lines of code, and there's some debate, was it 9 lines of code if you include the headers? But really, like, we started pitching to developers saying few lines of code, make a curl request for a certain amount in a certain currency and what the details are, and you're just going to get back a 200 OK response, and the payment was successful. Before then, it was really, really, really complicated to do online payments, and even today, we're chasing that goal of making it as simple as possible. And it's worked really well, right? So we're processing hundreds of billions of dollars for millions of global businesses. And so everyone from platforms to marketplaces, you think of all the favorite SaaS tools you use, plenty of in-person, point of sale, and retail and consumer, all of them have bought into this vision of really making it easy to use payments. Now, when I talk to developers from many of these companies and other companies, what you do realize is every one of these companies started somewhere. Maybe they were, a large company, and then they've moved their online payments flow. Certainly, online payments is just generally new over the last decade. And so, when you talk to developers who are in charge of payments for a company, what you realize is every company has a timeline, right? They all have a payments timeline, more specifically. And so let's just think about the dream, right? Going from startup to successful public company, right? So you think, okay, year one, we build the prototype is built. We hire the team. We're going to launch our app. Yay, we launch recurring revenue. Maybe the pricing needs to change year two. Maybe a CTO joins, and then the code gets refactored. You have a new hosting platform. Maybe you change programming languages or frameworks. Maybe you'll pivot the product. Perhaps you need to launch a platform. Maybe the entire development team gets swapped out. Perhaps you have a revenue model, the second gen of your revenue model. And so wherever you are, there's a history of payments where you're at. And then you got to think right now. I don't know exactly where your business is, but if I was to just generalize, you're making recurring revenue, you got some scaling challenges, you certainly have an existing code base, and there's a growing team. And so that is now, for example, as an example business, and really what you're trying to figure out as the payments decision maker or the lead dev or the payments architect at a company is like, what's next, right? So it's not enough to just say, I'm going to deal with the burning issues and hope everything keeps running okay, because you do also have to plan for your future. And so the question I ask a lot of developers is, hey, how do you upgrade your payment stack, right? How do you think about going about that? And the answer has been very surprising, right? So I'll show you some slides that definitely cause developers, including myself, some stress, right? So you see a notice in your dashboard that says upgrade available ... You click on it and you're like, oh my gosh, this account is on an API version set back in 2019 or 2018. It shows you all the things that are breaking changes. You need to update them. A little bit stressful. Perhaps you, a couple of years ago, yourself or a CTO before you, someone implemented an open source project that was popular in the community. And then you see a little note of a new update to the README file, and then you look and it goes, this library isn't actively maintained anymore. You're like, oh my gosh, we're using that to process a lot of money every month. That's not fun. And then if you're any developer running any project, you have just the daily annoyance of your Dependabot alerts popping up, regardless if they're high severity or low severity. And so definitely don't let those pop up. But I know if you're like me, it's the inbox. It can be a regular occurrence that you just gotta keep with it. So I'm sure you all have thoughts on Dependabot. And so the threat of all these, the stress you may or may not feel seeing notices and alerts of API updates, when I talk to the current payment leaders at companies big and small, I'm seeing the same trend of quote. They're telling me in confidence, right? So, for example, one startup founder of a profitable e-commerce business told me, "Why should I care about my payments? If it works and the money's coming in, I'm good. I'm focused on my product and my customers right now." And so right there, that is, my product is this, payments is this thing I got to deal with, but it's distracting. I just got to focus on XYZ. I get it. Talk to someone else who's running a SaaS business. Okay, if there's something new or something that I couldn't do before, but I really want to, yeah, I would be willing to upgrade to the newest version. So some hesitancy, but if it's worth my time, I'll do it. Cool. And then a lead developer for a large online education provider, straight up, I'm scared to update our payment system because I could make a mistake and we could lose money. And I think that honesty, it's important, because I do think that's why, with many things in life, why we don't take action, right? So no developer wants to break the company's payment stack. And so you just don't deal with it, or you punt it off, or the person after you figures it out or has to figure it out. And so why this matters, and something we don't tend to want to think about, but the really important thing here is, if your payment integration was built before 2019, you're running outdated code. I mean, the world has changed since that was implemented. And so we'll talk a little bit about that, but first and foremost, online payments have evolved massively. So even take us, for example. So I mentioned we've been around for a decade. Certainly when we started off, to make a payment, you would you'd have your API key and secret. You'd get a token for a customer. You'd be able to call out to our server, make a charge request of a certain amount in a certain certain currency, and you'd get a success, either a success or fail, that the payment was successful. You fast forward to anytime after 2018 and really 2019, payments online require you to listen to events and know the dance that happens between the different banks, the acquiring bank, the merchant bank, the regulatory requirements in a different region. All of this has to happen while the customer and you are waiting for the final confirmation of payment. And so payment intents, it was a huge shift. I was involved about 2.5 years ago when I came in. The European Union required secure customer authentication, which said that banks and in different countries within the EU, online payments had to occasionally be checked for biometric information, so Face ID, two-factor, some type of thing that authenticated the person was who they said they were. And that was one of the first absolute breaking changes for existing integrations we had to deal with, right? So you have to comply with your regulatory authorities. And so that required this concept of I'm requesting a payment, and then the banks will determine if the funds are there, if it's secure, and if it's good to go. And so that's massive. Now, the upside is payments have evolved. And so certainly when online payments came out, it was all about the card networks, so Visa, MasterCard, Amex, etc. You think in the last 5 years, how much has come around digital wallets, how much has come around local payment methods, right? So all these different ways to accept and receive payments has just rapidly changed in the last few years, especially installments, and we'll talk about that too. But tended to be in different regions, and it's fully in the U.S. In Europe as well too. And so, why this matters is if you think about an outdated legacy card form field, cards only drive 40% of the global commerce. And so certainly I know for myself, if I'm using a website that doesn't offer Apple Pay or Google Pay or a quick way to make a shopping purchase, I'm not going to go back to it. And so North America, we just love our plastic cards, but wallets are rapidly growing. Direct debit from your bank is rapidly growing. Certainly in Europe, same thing. Wallets, every country and many of the different regional players have some great online payment and wallet options. And then in Asia, wallets are the predominant way to send and receive money. Cards are waning, and there's a lot of bank options as well. And so you think through that, like cards is not driving the majority of global e-commerce, but then even in the US, right? So 37% of customers have Apple Pay or Google Pay. It's faster conversions. You have your address on file. And customers do prefer to use these when they're available. And so in addition, I thought one other stat was really interesting is installment options such as Afterpay and Klarna, very popular in the US, and it's rapidly growing. We've seen a major increase in the last year. It's just a new way to think about how you pay and finance for things at a micro scale. And so this is really important. It's really important that you know and understand all the bits of code in between you and your customers. And so what I want to talk about now is the importance of mapping out your payment flows. And so one thing I recommend, I've certainly done it with my colleagues, is Figma. Figma is just one of many solutions, but they have an app called FigJam, which allows you to do interactive whiteboarding or wireframing. And so whether you use Whimsical or Google Slides or Figma or whatever, what I'd encourage you to do is start mapping out your payment flow, and then have your team or your fellow developers or whoever your stakeholders are come in and add adjacent details as all together as you're working on it, so you can have documented a full picture of how your payment flows work. And so if we abstract away your classic payment flow, right? So the classic traditional online payment flow is a cardholder goes to a merchant, whether in person or online, swipes their card. The merchant then reaches out to their acquiring bank through a payment gateway. The acquiring bank, through the payment rails such as a card network, deals with the issuing bank, and then that comes all the way back to within milliseconds telling the customer and the merchant if the transaction is successful or if it's declined. But that's just general abstractions, right? So you really want to go into the details, right? So this, for example, most businesses are probably collecting, not most businesses, but many businesses are collecting revenue from different streams: invoices, point of sale, online hotels. They collect card details, but they authorize it later. There's all these different factors. So what are all the different ways someone can pay you? And then payments is just one part of your whole flow, right? So once the payment's successful, how are you going to deal with fulfillment? How are you going to keep track of loyalty and rewards points? How are you going to deal with inventory? You have to really map all this out to an extent that you know the actual versions of all the tech and tools you're using. A developer and an author I love reading online, Sean Wang, he's also known as Swix. He talks about the importance of being able to diagram out your flow, but also being able to speak it, like talk it out loud, speak it in natural language, right? So, okay, we're hosting on this, our database is powered by this, we're using authentication with this service, this is our payment provider, and for our custom business logic, we're using this. And so I think you being able to have confidence to just say what your payment stack is at, say, a developer meetup or next year's big transaction conference in person, you really want to be able to just whiteboard your stack and also be able to talk it out loud. If you can't do that, you have to put the work in. We certainly have to do that, right? So we have to check everything from regional and country regulatory bodies, all these different checkpoints to make sure transactions are successful. I strongly encourage you to do it for yourself as well. And so some practical tips for documenting your payment flows. First off, who are your internal and external stakeholders, whether you use a dev shop or if it's all in-house? Who's working on payments? And also, which payment products are you using? Is there home built solutions? Are you using third parties? How are you dealing with your payment products? Why this matters is the long-term success. If your business has long-term success, you know there's going to be new stakeholders, and there's going to be increasingly more complex challenges you have to solve. And so it's really important for you to know the products you're using and who's involved. Some other suggestions I have is, knowing what revenue models or payment flows are live, right? So are your customers one-time purchases, or their recurring subscription? If they are recurring subscriptions, are we talking tiered pricing, metered pricing, unit-based pricing? Like really understanding how and what you're charging for. An important one is, are you saving customer data for later purchases? Do you have the ability to save it? Do you intentionally not want to? And then the one that I kind of I alluded to earlier is, what are the available payment methods for each one of your customers in each one of your regions? And so being able to really think through and map that out is crucial for you. You want to think about what endpoints you're calling. So we'll talk about upgrading and testing also, but you want to make sure you understand that you want to make sure in your stack everything is not just melded into one payments function, right? You want to make sure your sending and receiving of money, that functionality is separate from your customer onboarding, which is separate from your webhook event handlers. Don't merge it all into a single place, because it's going to be difficult to test and break it out. And so you can also remember each one of those are utilities that you can upgrade incrementally and one by one. Think about how you're storing your webhook data and responses from the API. I know a big one that happens when you upgrade or think about your payment flow is other teams in your company. Your finance team, they might use webhook data for reporting to close their books. There's other teams that might require this data. And so just think about all the stakeholders. It goes back to the stakeholders point, but think about who else is implicated when you need to update a service. Certainly know the code and what SDKs are used. And so each piece of code, every library, every helper function used, they all, like all of us, they have a shelf life. And so just know what versions of each component are in use. What's the full chain of dependencies that you have running on your systems? And then also just make sure you have testing implemented or get started with making your plan. you have to have a robust test coverage. You have to have robust testing coverage, and in order to make sure your customers have a great experience, it's crucial for you to get moving on that. Another advantage of cleaning house, if you will, taking stock in the stack you have, what you can delete versus what you can use, is upgrading typically means you can simplify and dump a lot of legacy code. And so since digital wallets, since direct debit, since many regional providers have come out in the last several years, if you're using an integration that's card only or just straight, say for us, it's called Elements. I know every provider has a different name. You probably were having to manually build dynamic fields. Not dynamic. You were probably manually creating fields based on a payment method. You probably had to test them all individually, and so most of the payment providers offer the ability now to have customizable components, but also having the flexibility of it changes dynamically based on the payment methods a user a customer can utilize. And so I love when I see tweets from developers bragging about them being able to delete 10,000 lines of code because they updated their API and they cleaned house. And I would encourage you to get that feeling as well. All right, let's talk about testing and upgrading APIs and SDKs. And so API updates are new features for your customer, or they help protect your customer from downtime in leveraging the most they can from your payments experience. And so one thing we have to think a lot about is we're processing thousands of API requests per second. So we're updating our API all the time to make sure that we're improving both the speed, the performance, and the reliability of our platform so that any developer can have a very fast and solid payment experience. Uptime is really important, right? So a lot of the merchants that started as startups are now large-scale enterprise businesses. They need to make sure their scale and level of customers are supported, and API reliability is paramount for our business. And also, we're cutting on average about 13 API versions each weekday. And so, for example, in 2020, I think we deployed 3,300 times the API, different versions of the API. Now, most of them aren't breaking changes. We haven't had a major breaking change since August of 2020, but we're certainly adding new features and functionality and updates to parameters all the time, which means here are some considerations you should have when upgrading. So first off, do you understand what version of the API you're on? Do you know, and are you using test mode, but are you also mocking the data that you're getting back and forth from the API? I think the other one, other than the API version, is do you know the versions of your SDKs and the language, the frameworks you're using? This is important because I think I mentioned it before, but frameworks like Laravel, Django, all of them have their own versions, and typically those versions are tied to different versions of Stripe or other payment gateways. And so you really have to differentiate between the version of the API your Stripe account or other payment gateway account is on from the versions of the code you're using in your stack. And so certainly for us, it's important to know, like, statically typed client libraries. So you think like Java, Go, C#, they're all pinned to specific API versions. And so even if your Stripe account is on one version, you have to make sure you're using the latest versions of our SDK in order to get the full functionality. Dynamically typed libraries, so you think like Python, PHP, JavaScript, etc., you can set the API version through a header on a per call basis. A lot of developers have an optional flag that allows them to take their existing account and test it on multiple versions. So that's something to consider for those two different sets of languages. The other thing you need to think about is just the shape of webhooks, right? So often developers will set up a second webhook endpoint to a specific API version. And so this is important so that you're able to actually test and trigger and receive commands in a way that gives you confidence before you're ready to actually hit the upgrade button. And so understanding the differences of the versions and the state of your your API version, the current SDKs and frameworks you're using, and your webhooks is the full picture of what you have to have in mind when you're doing this work. Obviously, I strongly encourage you to read the API changelog. So we cover breaking changes. So we have backwards compatible changes, just new API resources, different things that, especially our new products we're releasing. And then we also want to make it really clear of what is in the latest version of the API that you may or may not have in the version you're using. And so we try to make that super clear. And so some tips for as you're setting up your testing, right? So certainly document your pay flows. It's a really good time to think about how you're surfacing and logging errors. All of this is just building a strong foundation. So first off, handle and log your errors, both for client side and server side. If they're client side errors, such as card declined or there's some issue with the transaction, please make sure the customers are seeing that, right? So that's typically something the customer themselves has to deal with. If it's a server-side error, we certainly don't want that to get dumped in front of customers, right? Those are detailed integration errors, and they're intended for your developers or whoever you work with to fix it. And so be mindful. Don't hurt the payment experience by having errors showing up in the wrong places. I think another one that's really important is, I mentioned mocking your data. Set up alerts for unknown data, right? Don't have silent failing if it doesn't know what to do, if the app doesn't know what to do. So think through your business logic, think through your app logic. By flagging unknown errors and event types that you don't know how to handle, by getting those alerts, it helps you pinpoint where your issues are. And so definitely set up alerts for unknown data. The last one is review how you handle webhooks, right? So make sure your endpoints can handle delays, duplicate notifications. If you've been building apps for a while, you know a classic one is you can't guarantee that the webhooks are going to come in the right order, and you have to be able to anticipate any set of timeline inconsistencies when you're getting events from a server, and know how to handle and deal with those in a way that makes sense for you. And so I also want to talk about open source dependencies in your stack. This is something definitely close to my heart. Several of us work a ton on open source and working with the open source communities of contributors and maintainers for projects all around the world. You think about applications, your payment flows, and API services, they all share a common trait, right? So they're all powered in large part by open source software and certainly by developers all around the world. And so we talked to a lot of companies about this, right? So for businesses running millions of transactions through the SDK, using frameworks, using packages, like, first off, who's building the dependency? Who's building code that is in between you and your customer? You should know that. You should know the names of those projects. I think also, as a successful business, you have to ask yourself, like, if you're relying on open source, there really is two main ways that the community would appreciate your contributions, right? So there's code contributions. Developers love when engineers from companies using a product are helping clean up anything from the documentation to updates, anything that can save a maintainer's time. And sometimes maintainers want to really keep a close rein on the code itself, and they would prefer receiving like recurring open source sponsorships. And so that's something we've been looking a lot at, right? So you have GitHub sponsors, you have TideLift, you also have Open Collective. These are all open source sponsorship frameworks that are really empowering developers to focus on the things they love, which is building code in projects that help developers all around, help benefit developers all around the world. And so in either case, whether you're considering making contributions to a project or you're considering sponsoring projects or packages for open source, like, get to know who's building this code, and certainly remind yourself that your business is relying on them, and the most importantly, make sure you're supporting them. Some developer resources as we wrap up, some things that I think that can help you think more about upgrading and testing your stack. check out our CLI. I would say most payment gateways, payment providers have decent command line support. So for us, it would just be stripe.com/CLI for Mac or for Linux or for Windows. You're able to listen to your account's webhooks. You're able to trigger API calls, and you're also able to load up fixtures for loading and test data. And so certainly check out the CLI. I'd also encourage you to use VS Code. Like, we have a great VS Code extension, which will pull in details from the API reference as you're coding. It'll also show the API, and it'll help you look at your API logs as you're building. Also, definitely bias here. I love the API, the Stripe API collection for Postman, and so whether it's a sales team or a product team, folks that just want to be able to fire API commands quickly, or even run some recurring testing through Postman, we have a great collection of all the Stripe API calls you can make on our service. So check that out. And then we produced a magazine called Increment. So this is a magazine dedicated and focused on developers and the art of developing. And so about a year and a half ago, we released an edition just dedicated to testing. So long form articles, different perspectives from engineering leaders and builders and founders on how they think about testing. You can read the whole magazine on increment.com/testing. And check it out. I really enjoy these short and long form stories from other engineers as they're thinking about deep, difficult, and complex problems that we're all facing together. I have to make a plug for our team, right? So we're constantly creating video and technical content and sample code showing you how to walk through everything from Postman API collections, making API requests, and really getting up and running. Certainly pre-pandemic, we never thought we'd all become YouTube live streamers, but here we are. It is we are in the digital age. So seriously, subscribe to youtube.com/Stripe developers. We have lots of content that I think will help you gain the confidence you need to have a great and up-to-date payment integration. And so I kind of leave you with this, right? So there's this concept that gets talked in engineering circles of, what's your product work, what's the new features you're doing, and what's your KTLO, or also known as keeping the lights on. And so often payments or updating payment dependencies can get dumped into this KTLO bucket because, like the quote I mentioned earlier, I got to focus on my product and my customers. And I think the thing I'd encourage you with is, in order for you to keep the lights on, you have to make sure your business is accepting, sending, and receiving payments in the most optimal way possible. And by punting off ongoing incremental improvements and updates, you're setting yourself up for a future that is actually going to affect you being able to keep the literal lights on. And so I think there's some pride and honor you can take in the idea of, we're going to make sure our customers, the entire product includes payments, and we want to make sure they have the best experience possible. And so really wrapping your mind on, like, the thing about keeping trains on time is, once you have the rails, once you have your plan, you're able to empower others to go really far. And so embrace KTLO, especially when it comes to payments, because it literally keeps the lights on. So thank you, everyone, so much. I really appreciate your time. I'm around for questions, and also feel free to ping me directly on Twitter. Again, I'm Chris_Trag, and this has been a delight. I look forward to the other sessions here at Big Transaction, and have a great day. See y'all.